Evening. I'm Mariam Ibrahim. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies minor at LUMS and the moderator for today. I welcome you all to this panel discussion organized as part of the Climate Congress, the closing program of the third edition of the Lahore Biennial. We, the Mushtaq Ahmed Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences, are delighted to co-host parts of the Climate Congress at LUMS and welcome you all to continue our debates and discussions on climate, ecologies, and environmentalism. Before I start with the introduction of the panel, I would like to call Dr. Ali Chima, the Vice Chancellor of LUMS, to come and say a few words to commence the event. Thank you.
Thank you. I just also want to add my welcome to LUMS for this important event and an extremely timely event which is being organized by the Biennale Foundation. I wanted to start by thanking Iftikhar Dadi, John Tain, Qudsiya Rahim for putting up a very topical and timely program. We're at a momentous day in the sense that we have new leadership in the world, which is going to raise questions about sort of whether the climate Congress is an appropriate topic of discussion. But for those of us living on ground zero of the climate problem, which is Pakistan, our life has become about heat, water and flooding, and about smog. So the way we built our houses, we sort of took sort of heat and temperature as a given. And now the way sort of heat is going, living has become just costly and unsustainable. So we go through the summer months bearing that cost, which is backbreaking, only to come upon October and November when we go into a crisis of shutting down educational institutions and being able to take very limited actions in a situation where parts of this community are facing huge challenges of functioning and livability. I can't think about something that is more important for the present. When people talk about the climate problem, they talk about futures, but this is not about the future. It is really about today. There's no better way to bring this alive than by bringing the urban fabric into a conversation with art, with discussion, with thought. But I think all of this should lead to one more thing, which is action. And at the end of the day, we can frame the problems, we can navigate that. That's important, particularly when climate deniability will continue to be an issue. But I think we need to take a step forward and also think about how and the pathways that can actually start to move the needle on people's livability. But thanks again for bringing a whole set of people together from both the city, from Pakistan, and from the world, and bringing together minds and people who are seeing this problem as an important problem. We have an excellent panel. I think Urban Ecologies is very, very timely. The cities are also at the forefront of the blowback that is happening. Looking forward to this discussion and engaging with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Chima. This speaks volumes to the discussions that we hope to generate through panel discussions like these and collaborations, interdisciplinary collaborations. Moving now to today's panel, we will be discussing urban ecologies and lived urban experiences. And understanding urban environments has never been more essential to advancing discussions on climate, ecology, and environmentalism. As we make the rural to urban transition of the world population a pivotal moment in human history, we must recognize that cities are also complex and multidimensional spaces of social, political, and cultural and economic interactions. Indeed, cities are also key sites of resource consumption, waste production, and greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, they're also uniquely vulnerable to the grand challenges that we face in the face of in the environment. While we discuss urban vulnerabilities today, we must also be cognizant of the fact that cities are spaces of agency and influence, holding the potential to shape resilient and sustainable futures. With these thoughts in mind, I want to now introduce to us, to everyone, our first panelist, Dr. Aman Jaffer. Dr. Aman Jaffer is an ethnographer, urban ethnographer, and sociologist. He is an Associate Professor of Sociology at LUMS, and his research is located in the study of religion and urbanism. He focuses particularly on sociality, community, and infrastructure in neighborhoods, markets, and Islamic institutions. His ongoing research projects include an analysis of urban citizenship in low-income neighborhoods of Lahore, which explores residents' engagements with the infrastructure of their neighborhoods as practices of forging political communities. His other project, which he will be discussing more today, investigates the social organization of the waste and recycling economy in Lahore by focusing on Afghan scrapyards and settlements of low-income nomadic communities. I welcome you on the stage.
Thank you, Mariam. Also, thank you, Sana, and everyone else who's put together this really important event. As Mariam said, I am interested in questions around the waste and recycling economies in Pakistan's urban centers. And specifically, I'm interested in how social relations and sociality broadly is critical to the creation of value and also to creating a life around waste reclamation and its recycling. So I wanted to start with showing you guys a short clip from a video. I should also add that this research is a collaboration between myself and Mohammad Naeem, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He actually recorded this during a visit to a scrapyard in which several Afghani lived and worked.
हाँ यार, कुछ आपसे आपकी ज़िंदगी के बारे में हमको पूछना चाह रहे हैं कि आप पढ़े हैं कुछ?
हाँ, पढ़े 2 क्लास तक 2 क्लास तक पढ़े हैं।
यानी 2 क्लास तक? दूसरी तक?
हाँ, दूसरी तक मैंने पढ़े।
तो वो आगे क्यों नहीं पढ़ा?
This is a rather long video and I won't have the time to show the whole thing. But what I want you to focus on is that Jalaluddin, the person in the frame, he's in his mid-20s. And at the time when we shot this video, he was planning to get married. In fact, he had a fiancée within the Afghan community. He was born and raised in Quetta, spent most of his life there. And intermittently, he moves to Lahore, but also has worked in Iran. And primarily his work is around waste reclamation and recycling. Now, what you saw in front of Jalaluddin was a pile of what looked like, waste material, broken down electric switches, plates, and things of that sort. What he is doing is to extract pieces of metal, mostly copper, iron, but also bits of wire and all other materials that could actually be traded on the extensive waste economy in the city. But when we spoke with Jalaluddin about what he is doing, he did not describe it in terms of any act of recycling or even act of extracting value. He spoke of it in terms of creating a future for himself with his fiancée. When we delved deeper into what he meant by that, he told me that his elder brother, who actually owns this scrapyard business, had given him a couple of sacks of such material and told him that if he wants to get married, he has to painstakingly extract all kinds of valuable material out of this material. And because in the Afghan and Pashtun tradition, what happens is that the boy's family or the boy himself would give a certain amount of money to the girl's family, who in turn would then use that money to purchase various items, furnishings, appliances, depending on how much money, of course, they get. So the entire future of the couple is essentially established through this kind of not a dowry, but kind of a reverse dowry, system. So what Jalaluddin is doing here essentially is to really create a future, a possible future with his fiancée. Mary Douglas and Gay Hawkins have argued that waste is an effect of classification and relation rather than a fixed category of things. Douglas even famously conceptualizes dirt as a social category constituted by matter that is considered to be out of place. If dirt was in its rightful place, it would not be dirty, essentially. So the labor of reclaiming and recycling that we saw here involves putting matter back into its place, or more appropriately, it is rearranging material in new configurations and new places so that it can have value anew. Importantly, this is not simply an act of physical labor, but also one of ontological labor, of going against the structuring capacities of a culture, against the very order of a culture. Melanie Sampson has argued that considerable political and intellectual labor is required to transform the social ontology of an object from waste to a commodity, from a garbage dump of unwanted material to a resource mine. And that is precisely what Jalaluddin is doing here. He is trying to transform the ontology of waste into actually something which is not just a commodity that has material value, but also something that defines his, a possible future for himself and his soon-to-be bride. In fact, this comes through very strongly in one of the stories that Jalaluddin recounted. Recently, he had visited the family of his fiancée, and he was invited to look at the material, look at the furnishings that the family had purchased with the money that he'd already sent them. Amongst these items, he was especially struck by a set of curtains. And he noticed that there was a very inviting floral pattern on the curtains. And he actually bent down to smell the flowers on the curtain. And he swore that he could actually smell a very, very pleasant fragrance. So much so that when he actually is doing this work that we saw, a very sort of laborious, very repetitious task of painstakingly sort of going through very minute material again and again for days, weeks on end, he imagines the fragrance that he felt in those curtains. So for him, this act of working with waste really has been transformed into an act of folding himself into the enchanted fragrance that he believes will soon be his future. The photo that you guys see here is telling a similar tale. Tariq, who you can perhaps see in the background in the gray, this is a dump site outside the Androon Sheher, outside the Bhati Darwaza in the Androon Sheher. And we, myself and Naeem Saab, met Tariq when we visited this dump site. And initially, he was telling us about the hazards of his work, about the kind of, he told me that this very day he had almost been pierced by a needle that someone had dumped in the trash, and the hazards of working with such material. So when we talked to him and asked him about how he ventured into the world of trash, we expected to hear stories of lack. After all, many, sort of even sympathetic accounts of those who work in reclamation, in the waste and reclamation economy, talk about figures of scavengers as one of the most wretched of the earth, right? Those who have been completely left behind by the ravages of capitalism and so on. But Tariq told us a very different story about why he works with waste. It was not his family conditions, or he didn't say that he was forced to work in trash, but instead he told us a story about his childhood, where he was obsessed with playing with marbles, kenchi or bante as we call them. And he said as a kid, that's all he could think about, okay, maine bante khelne hain. This was his obsession. And often enough, he didn't have enough money from his parents to purchase these marbles. So what he did was he started going around his neighborhood looking for these marbles. And this led him to piles of garbage, piles of trash that was often to be found in the corners of his streets. So he developed a sensibility, or he developed an interest in looking for things in trash, for looking for treasure, as he put it, in trash. And he often said that I would find some treasure. And that became his life. That became a career. So instead of treating waste or working with waste as something that he did because there was nothing else to do, he saw working with waste as a result of his almost natural inclination towards looking for things, towards seeking things out. I relate these stories not to somehow celebrate, working with waste, but to say that if we consider recycling, reclamation from waste, reuse to be sort of essential to questions of environmentalism, then transformation of how we see waste, how we see reclamation work, is essential to any successful project of recycling. Pakistan, by the way, Lahore, recycles by, I think, very conservative estimates, about 21% of all the waste that is produced in the city. If you compare this, for example, with New York City, the number is 17% for New York. I think this is a gross underestimate because the methodology that the folks who estimated this used seemed to focus only on certain streams of recycling and didn't really, I think, offer a very comprehensive account of those other streams. Therefore, I would probably put the number a little higher. But all of this recycling is happening not through any city government programs or through any even sort of corporate, initiatives, but it is happening through people like Jalaluddin and Tariq, who are scrounging the city, going through waste dumps, but also collecting waste from the streets, going around in bicycles, who are also purchasing waste items from households and shops. As you can see, here's a shopkeeper who's selling his waste, or collecting items, in their sacks or boris as they're called, while traversing through the city's various neighborhoods, markets, and roads. This is the inside of a sack that we encountered. That is how most or almost all of the recycling that's happening in Lahore is done. And what I want to also now, the second point that key point that I want to emphasize is that this is not happening in some kind of isolation, that this is happening within very complex social systems. Let me show another short clip to give you a sense of this, how this works. Just to give you a little context, this is Mazang, which is a sort of pretty old neighborhood of Lahore, a pretty sort of dense locality. And what we see is a young child who is going to a scrapyard to sell his wares.
वो बच्चों क्या कर रहे हो?
This is probably the highlight of the video, so I'll stop right there. So this child, he has to deal with his mother. As some of you may know, that in mohallas of Lahore, it is quite common for children to go to these small neighborhood shops to buy candy, to buy some snacks, chips, and whatnot. In fact, many times in the day, they would go and do this. This child is especially fond of candy. And he pestered his mother all the time that that he needs money for to buy candy. The deal that he now has with his mother is that instead of giving him money, he gets these plastic bottles and other materials that he can sell at this kabad khana for a few rupees. Now, for this child, but also there are of course examples of other older folks in this locality as well who visit the kabad khana on a pretty regular basis. So the kabad khana here is not simply about recycling, but it is actually embedded very much in the very cultural fabric of this locality. It has become essential to the entire exchange of materials, has become essential to the whole culture of consumption in the locality, but also to developing a certain entrepreneurial sensibility, as this boy nicely demonstrated. Similarly, if you look at other kabad khanas in Lahore, this is a kabad khana in near Mall Road, which is run by Fazal. You might see him waving with a peace sign in the back. And these are all Afghans, ethnically Afghans from Quetta, who have relocated to Lahore to work in this economy. Now, not only are these folks involved in the generation of economic value, but this scrapyard is also very much at the center of the Afghan social world in Lahore. So I often heard about how when an Afghan musician would visit the city, he would also hang out with these folks in the scrapyard. I often heard about when there's a cricket match, especially now that the Afghan cricket team is doing even better than Pakistan's. They would hang out here to watch the match and recently also celebrate their victories. But also the relationship that these men forge in the process of exchanging recyclable material is critical to their very survival in the city. When they run into trouble with the police, when they need support, they need loans to tide them over, when they need to send money to their families, it is the exchange networks of recycled material that they depend on to achieve these goals. So it is through the embeddedness of all these practices of working with waste, of extracting value from waste in these social systems that makes the whole economy possible, that allows for the consistent extraction of value and for these activities to sustain in a manner that is not only serving many of the you could say industries of the city. Much of Pakistan's economy actually depends on the kind of materials extracted from waste that these folks are doing. To give you an example, if you look at the cable manufacturing industry in Pakistan, I think besides one or two cable manufacturers, almost all of them actually rely on the labor of folks that you see here and other folks like them to supply, copper and other materials for their construction. The same goes for paper mills located within and outside Lahore. So really, it is the lifeblood of the cities and the region's economy. And many of the networks that these economies rely on are not just located in Lahore or even in Pakistan, but actually spread as wide as Dubai and China. So these are not somehow sort of formless or marginal activities, but these are actually very much the lifeblood of many of our economic sectors. And by seeing them not simply as an economic exchange, but also as a way of life. I follow Wittgenstein, who uses the concept of forms of life to represent multiple ways of being in the world that have emerged from humanity's historical practices. Each form of life in his formulation represents a distinct and mutually exclusive way of seeing the world. So the picture that I've sketched here is what I consider to be a very distinct form of life inculcated in Lahore's recycling economies, and which revolves around giving new meanings, shape, and value to materials that others consider useless, dirty, and polluting. It is based on establishing rich, sometimes transient relations with material and fellow humans, and characterized by by dealing with multiple forms of stigma. So the labor of unmaking waste that I describe is deeply intertwined with the condition of marginality on the one hand, but also with the vagaries of everyday life on the other. So on the one hand, the scrapyard is a place where labor is appropriated, where exploitation of labor also occurs, but at the same time, it is also a place where an active life is forged with and around waste. And the systems enacted by scrapyards and other spaces of recycling in Lahore thus offer a unique mechanism for embedding waste into the life and social matrix of the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aman. And yes, it was very well timed. So to continue our discussion, I will now call our second panelist, Anika Vattu. She is a writer, a poet, translator, and a teaching fellow at LUMS. She has an MPhil in Modern South Asian Studies from the University of Oxford. Her current research explores the intersection between gender and the politics of spaces in Pakistan. Her poetry and essays have appeared in The Meridian, McNeese Review, New Ohio Review, and Southern Humanities Review, amongst others. Her poetry has been nominated twice for the Pushcart Prize, and she is the founder of the Creative Room, Pakistan's first interdisciplinary humanities platform for online learning focused on South Asia. Anika, I would like to call you on stage.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Thanks for inviting me. And it's so wonderful to present here alongside my fellow panelists, alongside Aman, Ameem, and Nosheen. Thank you to everyone who's come out here. This is such a wonderful crowd. So what I'm going to be talking about is women, public spaces, and the city, everyday modalities of being and belonging in Lahore. A little bit about kind of like the main questions I'm looking at. So my overarching research and question is about working class women's aspirations and visions for their life. You know, what are they working towards? How do they imagine themselves? And as an ethnographer, when I set out, the question I had in mind, which has now been challenged a lot, like the question itself was, what kind of relation do these women have with the notion of the city as citizens, right? And it's that question that at the end, as like I'll discuss, gets challenged. So what are working women's dreams and visions for their life with regards to freedom, upward social mobility, and of course, empowerment? And in this presentation, in today's project, amongst this broader project, what I'm focusing on today is their experiences of using public transport in Lahore and their navigation of everyday instances of harassment and navigating safety issues when they venture out into the city for work. So, in terms of my research methodology, I've worked as an ethnographic researcher with Amir Begum Welfare Trust, an NGO, to conduct interviews with women associated with their welfare programs. I want to emphasize here that I'm looking at the lived realities of women. I'm trying to listen to their stories. And when we listen to their stories, I'm trying to pay specific attention not just to what they're saying in language, but even more interestingly, what's left out of language. So I'm as interested in their silences as I am in their speech. And I have been conducting in-depth interviews for the last 3 years. I've done over 25 interviews, and I'm presenting in today's presentation some of those. My study adopts an anthropological and gender studies kind of lens to listen to their stories, and I'm using strands of intersectional feminism to interpret and analyze some of these stories. So to start with, I want to give a bit of theoretical background, and there are two particular movements which have kind of inspired a big part of this project and the thinking that has gone behind my research. So in Pakistan, we have had the Women at Dhabas Collective in Karachi, which was this very interesting movement that started with one woman, Sadia Khatri, who was a writer, a blogger, and she would just go to these tea stalls, these dhabas, and she would sit and have a cup of tea there. And slowly she started posting these images on social media, and it picked up. And the whole idea was that what happens when a woman goes and occupies a public space, not for a purposeful activity, not for an activity that has a clear, efficient, functional use, not for work, but rather just to be there, absolutely for nothing. What if a woman just sits there and spends time? What happens when women occupy these or enter these spaces for leisure, for recreation? Now, interestingly, this picks up 3-4 years ago in Pakistan, and 10 years ago in India, we have this major book that's come out, which has become phenomenal in urban studies, called Why Loiter. So it's written by Shilpa Parke, Samira Khan, and Shilpa Ranade. And there are so many interesting arguments there. What I want to kind of focus on is this question that they raise. Does access to public space equate with the right to public space for women? So this conversation started when, India was claiming in a lot of kind of development discourses, this conversation was happening. We have these major global cities like Mumbai, like Delhi, where we now see more women in the labor force. We see women in metro trains, we see women in malls, in banks, in offices. But the question that these authors raised was, are these women feeling safety and psychological ease when they're in those spaces? And also, this kind of freedom and this kind of visibility, is it only for women of certain social professions and certain classes? Or is this visibility accessible for all women? And of course, the answer is that in the narrative of the global city, a woman of a particular class, and this is the word I want to focus on, demonstrable respectability, have greater legitimacy in public than many men of a lower class, but I'll also say many other women. So there are various subgroups, and this is the interesting stuff where when I did my ethnographic research, of course you go in with certain presumptions, and a lot of those were challenged. So this notion of demonstrable respectability is something I'm going to keep coming back to. So they argue, these authors argue that the quest for pleasure and the struggle against violence are deeply interlinked. A lot of the conversation on feminism has focused on violence and how to protect women from violence, whereas they say we also need to focus on positive rights such as women's access to pleasure, to leisure, to recreation in public spaces. Now, I want to turn to some of my findings. So the way I've done this, structured this presentation is I have chosen moments of instances of the interviews I did in my research, and I'll just take you through them. So the first kind of basic question that I asked them was, what form of public transport do you take to work, and how safe or unsafe does it feel? And the first respondent is Javeria Shakil. She is a beautician employed at Ghar. This is an interesting industry that's booming, by the way, which is at-home beauty services. Her age is 34. Her husband's occupation is a tailor. The reason I'm adding these details is that I was interested in this question. What is the income distribution of these houses? How much is the wife contributing? How much is the husband contributing? So in this case, the wife is contributing roughly 60%, she says, and she says 40% comes from the husband depending on season, right? So depending on demand. And she is Christian in terms of religious affiliation. So she says, usually I take a local rickshaw, Sawari wala. They take 30 rupees for every stop. And at every stop, other people will sit with us. At the back, it's just women, but at the front, they give seats to men as well. And my follow-up question was, do you feel safe when you use this form of public transport? And it was a very definitive answer, not at all. And then she said, during COVID, it was very tense. It was so congested. If you've seen autos, you know how there's a small seat at the front. They'd make 3 or 4 people sit there and 3 or 4 people at the back. So it was unsafe for us in terms of health. And some women are really scary. I feel afraid when I sit with them. This is the part where the interview just like goes into a direction that I wasn't expecting. So I asked, like, who are these women? Like, who are you talking about? What makes you feel afraid of certain women who sit next to you in these rickshaws? So I've chosen, generally I've translated to English, but I'm reading out the Urdu line here that struck me. कभी कभी औरतें ही इतनी खराब बैठी होती हैं, and then the translation of the rest is, they don't talk nicely, their behavior isn't nice. God knows where they've been and what they've been doing. I feel scared just looking at them. Now, this is the whole kind of interesting bit. And here we're veering back to the why loiter text and this whole notion of manufacturing respectability. So I want to provide a bit of historical context here. So the social organization and stratification of cities in South Asia has historically been majorly affected by certain perceived notions of what kind of women can occupy these spaces, and we've seen marginalization at the spatial level also for women. So in the late 19th and early 20th century India, we saw attempts to regulate, sanitize, and cleanse the city by colonial authorities. And a kind of like noteworthy like thing happens here where cities expand. So urbanization, massive urbanization is happening. We see a wider public sphere emerging. But spaces for workers in certain socially transgressive or dirty professions shrink. And I've written in my note here, because I was listening to the wonderful talk by Dr. Aman on how dirt as a social category he talked about, right? So these are the professions. So sex work is also one of those professions here. And Charu Gupta, an Indian historian, writes in her book, Sexuality, Obscenity, and Community, the middle classes of Uttar Pradesh, so we're talking about North India, continually appealed for special laws to expel prostitutes from thoroughfares and compel them to live in settlements set apart. It was pointed out that in civilized towns like Bombay and Lahore, prostitutes lived in specified areas outside towns where they could be under constant police vigilance. So the reason I'm bringing this up is I want us to think about the stratification of women into types and what kind of behavior and what kind of women are accepted in public spaces. So morally upright women versus corrupt or more questionable women. Now the next question, and now we're going back to the interview findings, was which mode of transport feels safe to you and which feels most unsafe? And the answer I got from this respondent, Leviza Yaqub, who's a beautician providing at-home waxing services since 25 years. She's older than the previous respondent, so she's in her 50s. And age really, I've noted, really affects women's experiences of safety, harassment also. She says, I think a car is the most dangerous. I want to pause here and say, so her income level was a bit higher than Javeria's, and therefore for her, when she goes to a client's house and she selects the form of transport, she thinks, okay, I can do InDrive, I can do Uber, do I want to select a bike, a car, or a rickshaw? And sometimes she rents a car. So she says, I think a car is the most dangerous because it's solely controlled by the driver. And once you're in it, you can't get out. Bike feels safer to me. If they even bother you a bit, you can get off. A bike has to park at the signal. Everyone is watching. You can't be the wrong one. And the line in Urdu that struck me was, Har banda dekh raha hota hai, aap galat nahi ho sakte. So this, I think, raises this whole and complicates our whole notion of visibility, right? So when we think of upward social mobility generally, and when we think of a higher income level, you think of an access to a car as a huge privilege, right? But I felt like many of these answers complicate any simplistic notion we have, where a woman will feel safer in a car versus, for example, a bike, which is actually, she's more open to climatic elements, she's more exposed to the environment, but she's feeling safer there. And then, of course, when you talk about transport, there are various instances of harassment that come up. So if someone bothers a woman using public transport, how do you think she should deal with it? And I asked, how do you deal with it? And the answer was, in my opinion, it's better not to speak up. This was from one respondent. If you speak up, you'll be turned into a performance for their entertainment. It will become a tamasha. If you raise a voice or create a drama, the next day that boy will bring 3 other boys with him and they'll be waiting at that stop for you. You have to take that route every day. So what good will it do you? And then I wanted to also know how a woman in that situation is thinking in terms of other men around her and who she can ask for help. So I said, would you expect other people in that location to help if you ask for help? And she says they will definitely try to help, but mostly wo chaske lenge. They will enjoy the situation and entertain themselves through it. So yeah, just like in terms of like a woman stepping out of the house and going into the city. And in the later slides, I think I've also put up like small maps of like routes that they are taking. Many of these women are coming from Yuhanabad, they are coming from Nishtar Colony, they are coming to places like Gulberg. The threat of violence is so palpable and real, but what my research is interested in exploring is how they come up with unique strategies that work for them to deal with the threat of violence that may not match with what we think of as the right way or the mainstream form of resistance towards violence. And as we kind of move towards the last bit of the presentation, the wider question I wanted to ask was like, how do women approach work and think of work? You know, this whole very simplistic notion of liberal feminism that work is essentially and simplistically a very empowering thing, and now we've seen criticisms of that notion. So a question that I asked was, if you didn't need to work to financially support yourself or your family, you know, if there's 1 year where your husband comes and says, "Sab set hai, everything is taken care of, you don't need to work," would you still work? And again, I felt like there were very interesting answers. So this respondent is an ICU nurse since 6 years. She lives in Yuhanabad, and she is one of the younger respondents. And her husband is a tailor, and they both flexibly and jointly contribute to household expenses. She says sometimes he contributes more and I stop working, I even take time off, and sometimes it's vice versa. So she said, life has its ups and downs, but we should save something for ourselves. When we do a job, we can take care of ourselves better. Going out makes you feel happy. Going out makes you feel happy. I thought this itself like says a lot. I feel that the more we try to stay in our comfort zone, the less we face challenges in life. So I want to emphasize here that this is not a translation. She used the phrase comfort zone, and I was struck by it, so I asked her again, and I said, what do you mean by comfort zone? So she said, comfort zone means a place where we feel the safest, like home. If we always stay there, we don't get to learn new things or face new challenges. When we step out of our homes, we learn something new and feel more good about ourselves. Staying in one place doesn't allow us to grow or feel very good. So I think what I wanted to pick on and like think about, and for all of you also, is like a place where we feel the safest, like home. We now know from research that in the divide of the gendered space of the private and the public sphere, both of which are gendered in numerous ways, the home is where a significant amount of violence takes place, where a significant amount of unsafety actually is experienced by women. But this imagination of the home as a safe space and the world as a hostile space, where still we will brave it, we will go, we will come up with strategies. I felt that there's a lot going on here. There were also so many moments in interviews when I asked this question, okay, when you think about home, what are the strategies of making yourself safe? Or how do you experience safety or violence in the home? Where there would be a moment of hesitation. And it was a very kind of tender and vulnerable moment, because I felt as the researcher that there might be a moment of emotional honesty and a very uncomfortable question, but mostly in those cases after that moment of hesitation, women said, no, at home it's fine, it's safe. So that itself, I think, is something to really explore when we think about how women perceive and think about these spaces and what their stories are telling us, and of course, what are those silences telling us. And the last thing was this broader question. I asked many of them, if you could change one thing about Lahore that would make your life better, what would it be? So one of the answers I got was again about like spatial organization of cities, but also like planting of trees, and also like what kind of air are women breathing, and what kind of air everyone's breathing there. So she said, Pinky Daud said, I would ask them to do something about smog. In areas like Model Town, where there are more trees and parks, it's more comfortable. A lot of her clients are in, not her clients, sorry, the hospital where she works at is here. In middle class areas, this isn't the case. There isn't a single park in Johanabad. In Nishtar Colony, where more Muslims live, there are parks. When I travel from Johanabad to Ghazi Road Defense side, I feel it. There's a freshness from the trees here. But in Johanabad, there's a burning sensation in the eyes and a scratchy feeling in the throat. Often it becomes hard to see at night. And so I think more than like conclusive findings or anything, this is very much an ongoing project. It raises some important questions that we can maybe think about more. So the first one, I think it's not listed here, was how any simplistic notion of resistance as active and vocal is really problematized by this research and by women's actual lived experiences, where sometimes resistance is in the form of not responding and not raising a voice to the instance of violence or harassment, and instead braving that situation, or instead choosing kind of sustenance, you know, taking that route again and again. The other important point it raises is when women go out of the private sphere into the public sphere, there is a great deal of anxiety about the dichotomy of good, respectable women versus bad, morally corrupt women. And I think in more simple discourses, it's the threat of lower class men. So a lot of the Why Loiter study is about lower class men posing this threat to middle class women, and she of course questions that as well. But here we are seeing stratification of women into various categories of kinds of women, and what kind of woman it's okay to, for what kind of women it's okay to occupy public space. And the broader thing I think that it kind of raises is lived experience, as opposed to a development angle that might be more top-down, is fractured, specific, heterogeneous, and personal. Few of the interviewees had much to say about Lahore as a city. It is made of the lived and fragmentary experience of parts and chunks and aspects of urban life. So this question that I had set out to, because in all my classes and in my masters, I'd read these texts like Olivia Ling's The Lonely City and Certeau's Pedestrian View from Above. And I went with this question, what is a woman's relation with the city? And that was not the question that I actually found answers to. Instead, I found that women relate to urban spaces through very particular aspects and chunks and parts of urban life that affect them. And lastly, the ability or desire to conceptualize or theorize about an imaginary or real relation with the city seemed very dependent to me on privilege and access to economic and cultural capital. So yeah, these are just some things to think about, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Anika. That was truly very, very interesting. While we talk about these urban lived experiences, vulnerabilities, and forms of agency that we see come up, I would now like to call our third panelists for today. So basically for the third panel, we have Dr. Ameem Lufti and Dr. Nosheen Zaidi, who will be co-presenting on vulnerabilities with respect to the ecological environmental hazards as well. Dr. Ameem is a historical anthropologist and an assistant professor at LUMS. He specializes in transnational mobility and military labor markets. His research is on his research on Baloch diaspora's enduring influence across multiple states informs a broader exploration of geopolitics from below, examining how non-state actors and networks shape contemporary global dynamics. His engaged research, which he will be talking about today, is based in Lahore, and it bridges the academia and community through interdisciplinary collaborations, working with biologists, urban planners. He investigates water inequalities and its impact on public health in urban areas. This engaged research demonstrates a commitment to engaging with marginalized communities, not as research subjects, but as partners in a collaborative effort to expand anthropological knowledge, combat inequality, and help communities flourish. Alongside him is Dr. Nausheen Zaidi. She has a doctoral in biochemistry and is an esteemed professor and researcher at the Punjab University. With a wealth of academic qualifications and international certifications, her research focuses on tumor metabolism and facets of cancer biology. In addition to these contributions to cancer research, Dr. Nausheen Zaidi has been working on water quality mapping, an initiative that helps to identify water contamination zones in Lahore, and they have conducted over 1,200 samples, and they will be talking to you more about it. And so looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Ameem and I, we are working together on a project of water quality mapping. And for the Lahore chapter of this project, we have collected and analyzed over 2,000 samples now, and we have identified different areas in the Lahore with different sets of problems. So today I'm going to talk about some aspects of this data that we collected over the course of this project. And I'll be talking about the presence of antibiotic resistant bacteria in Lahore's water supply. So antibiotic resistance is a situation where bacteria evolve to resist the effects of antibiotics that are supposed to kill them or stop their growth. So, which means that bacteria becomes resistant, which can result in long-term infections or infections that are not easily treated, or sometimes they can not be treated. It is a burden on the healthcare system. It makes the treatment expensive. It increases the mortality rate, and also long-term infections. Here you see this diagram of a bacteria which is resisting drug through different mechanisms. There is a possibility that the drug cannot enter the bacterial cell. Sometimes the drug enters, but it is pushed out of the cell. And sometimes the bacteria develops a mechanism to destroy the drug. Antimicrobial resistance is a growing threat to global health. I'm using the term antimicrobial resistance now, and earlier I was saying antibiotic resistance. So antimicrobial resistance is a more wider term that includes antibiotic resistance, antifungal resistance, and antiviral resistance by their respective organisms. So each year, an estimated 7.7 million deaths are associated with bacterial infections. Out of which 1.27 million are caused by bacterial pathogens resistant to antibiotics available to treat them. And this number is very rapidly increasing. And according to some estimates, if we don't do anything dramatic about it, this number can reach to 10 million per year. So WHO has urged all the countries to develop their own national action plans. Pakistan's national action plan was, I think it was developed in 2017. So I think everyone is somewhat familiar with the concept of antibiotic resistance. But just very quickly, that when there are high number of bacteria, some of them get mutated and they become resistant to antibiotics. And this bacteria, which is resistant, it grows and the strain grow and multiplies. But this is one part of the story. This is vertical gene transfer from one generation of bacteria to the next one. But it is more complicated than this. Bacteria also have the capability of horizontal gene transfer, which means that it is not from one generation to another, but they can transmit a part of its genetic material to the other bacteria that are in their close proximity, which is, so bacteria that have that are antimicrobial, antibiotic resistant genes, they can serve as a reservoir for antibiotic resistance. And this horizontal gene transfer can even occur between bacteria of different species. So it is very dangerous, and it is a very important concept to grasp because of the data that I'm going to discuss later. So everyone is, I think, familiar with the general concept. Antibiotic resistance, the main causes of antibiotic resistance are overprescribing of antibiotics, patients not finishing their treatments, overuse of antibiotics in livestock and fish farming. So there are some general causes of antibiotic resistance, but we keep forgetting, or like people don't talk about it much, that there is also a possibility to get exposed to AMR resistance through environment. So if we are exposed to contaminated water or soil, we are exposed to antimicrobial resistance. One health concept now, most of the countries, they are incorporating this concept of One Health into their national action plans against antimicrobial resistance. This is a simple concept which incorporates everything. So it recognizes the interconnectedness between human health, animal health, and environmental conditions. So I think Ameem will talk about it later. So the bacteria, basically, it travels from human body to animal body to environment and then back again. We are all exposed to AMR infections, but different demographic factors make us more vulnerable to these infections as well, which age and sex are one of the factors that I will discuss with respect to the data that we have. Very recently, in September 2014, one review came out of World Health Organizations and from WHO. And according to this review, women are more likely to get AMR infections, and they have identified various factors which make women more prone to get infected. And in October 2000, last month, they had a meeting in which they asked all the countries to incorporate this sex and gender angle into their national action plan. They also recognize that 70% of the countries do not consider sex and gender to be an important component of their national action plans. This map shows the AMR risk index, which is calculated using different components. And as you can see here, Pakistan is among the countries with highest AMR risk index. Okay, so coming back to the water quality mapping project. As I said earlier, that we have been working on this project for last 3 years now. And we have collected and analyzed over 2,000 samples from Lahore. And this is a map that shows coliform positive sites in Lahore. Coliforms are bacteria that indicate a contamination with sewage water. So if you find coliform bacteria in water supply, it means that the water is contaminated with sewage water, right? So we identified 7 neighborhoods in Lahore where which were hotspots for coliform contamination. And when I say they are hotspots for coliform contamination, it means that other areas also have this problem, but in these 7 neighborhoods, this problem is more significant. This bar graph shows the percentage of affected household in each of these neighborhoods. And as you can see here in Charar, 65% of the households were receiving contaminated water. And the similar percentage was observed in Mustafabad and so on and so forth. This line graph shows the prevalence of waterborne diseases in these areas. And as you can see that these two factors are very closely associated. They are correlated. And we also collected data on access to filtration plants, because generally it is thought that if somebody has access to filtered water, the prevalence of waterborne illnesses may go down. But if you can see for Charar, 100% of the population in Charar have access to filtration plants, but still the prevalence of waterborne illnesses in this area is very high. And the reason is that though people are using this water for drinking, they are, for the other domestic purposes, they are still consuming the same water supply, which is heavily contaminated with coliforms and pathogenic bacteria or disease-causing bacteria. So so this is like in some areas here you can see that in Mustafabad, the disease is higher though. So basically these two factors are not correlated. This graph shows this correlation in a better way, and the size of these bubbles, they represent the number of households. So in Chungi, we estimate that almost 34,000 households are receiving contaminated water. In addition to that, we are also studying other bacteria. So we know that bacteria are there in our environment. Of course, there are bacteria in water, but these bacteria are not necessarily pathogenic. Pathogenic means they're not disease-causing bacteria. So we are also collecting data on this general bacterial count in water samples across Lahore. And if you can see here, this map shows these orange droplets. They represent the number of the samples that displayed higher HPC or heterotrophic plate count. So unfortunately, in Pakistan government's guidelines or Punjab government's guideline do not provide any regulatory limit for these bacteria, because of course they consider that they are non-pathogenic, so it is not important. This regulatory limit that is provided here is coming from EPA. The one thing that is very important to understand, that though these bacteria are non-pathogenic, their high number in water represent that whatever treatment method VASA or Cantonment Board are applying, they're not working because the number is very high. And when I say high, it means that it's not 600, it is 10,000, 20,000, and sometimes, like in some cases, it is 50,000. So it's very, very high. So very quickly, I would like to show you that the bacteria, the non-pathogenic and pathogenic bacteria that we have found in the water supply are also resistant to multiple drugs. So this is the data for the pathogenic bacteria, and for the non-pathogenic bacteria, it is even higher. So if you recall the thing that I said in the beginning, that bacteria have the capability of horizontal gene transfer. So these non-pathogenic bacteria are serving as a reservoir for this antibiotic resistance in our water supply. And if these bacteria come in contact with pathogenic bacteria, they have capability of transferring these genes. So it is very dangerous. And as you can see here, that almost 38% of the water samples that we tested were contained multi-drug resistant bacteria. It means that they were resistant to at least 4 drugs. So the situation is very scary, and we are doing some interventional programs against AMR as well, but I think we'll discuss it later in the Q&A section.
Yeah. Thank you. Noshin did the biology part of it, of laying out the extent of the problem and this issue of antimicrobial resistance being developed. I'm interested in, or my portion of the research is thinking about how infrastructure makes the conditions for these biological forms possible. Yeah. Normally, when we think about infrastructure, you think of infrastructure as objects that connect, as passive objects, right? But what we see here is infrastructure becomes the conditions in which biological form is actually life comes to be, right? So the failure of infrastructure, it results not in nothingness, but it results in new biological form. Yeah. And infrastructure we see does not just connect, but it transforms beings itself. When bacteria goes from one bacteria to another, or when it goes to a population level, then we're seeing a very fundamental change in our very core sort of composition itself. Yeah. So it raises the stake of infrastructure by quite a lot. I'm not going to go over all over the like some of the stuff is repetitive. This is similar to what Noshin has talked about. So we know already that the problem is not a problem for everyone equally. Yeah, and it's a question for those of you who've heard me speak before. I've asked this question about, is water inequality an everybody problem, or is it a somebody problem? And the data that Noshin chose, and this indicates that it is particularly a somebody problem. Some areas are worse impacted by it, but with the research that we're doing with antimicrobial resistance, I think it opens it up new kinds of questioning, and I'm going to get into it. Why I think that moving from a somebody problem to an everybody problem might be a way of approaching AMR. This is the kind of my apologies for the poor quality of the images, but the problem is that some of this stuff is hard to come. I mean, we don't even the infrastructure layout of Lahore's water supply. It's not easy to get. You have the master plans, but you don't have a lot of data on what it actually looks like at this current state. So this is a sort of a near proximate of it. It gives you an idea when it gives you that the water supply, the state as is doesn't supply to the entire city, actually supplies to a small portion of it. And then it also, the other thing that I want to point out too, is that this is data from Urban Unit, which is a kind of subsidiary of the state, but they, as is, give some indication of the quality of pipeline. This is the ABC is a category of pipeline, with A being the best and C being the worst. And you can see already in some of these official documents, you get a sense of the quality of the pipeline or the degradation of the pipeline. This is maybe this is a better indicator of that same thing, of that same data, that you see that that not all pipelines are bad, but the majority are, right? So which are two important things to keep in mind. This is a more sort of a more basic data of the infrastructure that exists of the that carries the water. Lahore's much of the water that the city supply comes from tube wells that states operates, and the tube wells are connected through both water pipeline and sewage lines. Sewage lines are often places open as well. And the third part is this kind of daily routine. It's not the same everywhere, but it's an important thing to keep in mind later on the routine. So as I said, that the main point is for me to interested in how infrastructure changes the conditions of life itself. And I say it changes the conditions of life itself mainly because of these three factors that I want to point out too. One is this image of one is leaky pipelines. Yeah. So when there is leakages in pipeline, the probability of sewage seeping in is higher. Areas that have higher leakages, there will be higher leakages. So a very human or infrastructural factor, determines, the number of coliforms and eventually antimicrobial resistance at a very population level as well. The second is, the open sewage, or which, the sewage seeps into, we've been talking about it sort of, especially with tube wells and the dropping water levels, sewage seeps into the soil. and it seeps into other water as well. So this contamination then stays with us for a much longer time, and it's much harder to care about. And the third thing is about the intermittent timing. A lot of the research on bacterial, it shows that when there is not a regular supply, when water shuts off, it creates a negative zone that leads to biofilms forming over some of the substances. That biofilms has a higher propensity of forming of coliform. So that can be in the pipeline itself, but also then it can carry on into storage tanks as well. So the fact that we don't have regular water also leads to higher growth. So what it clearly shows that infrastructure has everything to do with biology itself. And this is, I want to, I don't have much time and want to leave more time for question answers. This is an exploratory point about how to approach this. And the great part about working with an interdisciplinary profession is that you get very new ways of thinking about some old problems. So infrastructure is an old problem for anthropologists. But an interesting way that I'd been thinking about since we've been doing this research together is this idea of also like horizontal gene transfer, and using horizontal genes transfer as a method of thinking about how social forms connect, how different social forms connect. Yeah, and or specifically, I mean, I'm interested in thinking about that it leads to that the connection between forms is not just vertical or linear in terms of one passing another, but it's also it passes on to the adjacent forms. Yeah. So it's not just the problem is peculiar to specific groups, as one would believe if it's somebody problem, and as we see in more data that there's an increasing tendency of populations opting out of this problem. Yeah, you get mineral water and then you opt out of it, but problems like antimicrobial resistance, like the gene transfer, shows that even if you are not directly connected to it, through this kind of proximity, there's every likelihood of you being impacted by it. And secondly, about the temporality thing. So the time period of if there is this a horizontal gene transfer, that means that the doubling time for this problem is much shorter, and that, as Nausheen pointed out, some genes become reservoirs for these things. Even if bacteria themselves that is not harmful becomes reservoir for antimicrobial resistance. Yeah, so then it becomes, so we see that it becomes cyclical, and it becomes much more rapid, and it has a longer lifeline. But this temporality in itself is created by these other temporalities of what is the water supply timeline. Yeah, if the temporality of that changes, what does this do for this? Or vice versa as well. Vice versa, if there is more information. I mean, one of the problems in dealing with these issues is that what happens when you tell somebody that your water is bad? Then they say, okay, some areas then could opt out of it buying it, but other areas, you think about, okay, I have to go to I have to either invest certain amounts of it, or I have to go to a filter plant, which requires time. So then it creates other kinds of temporalities. The pressure that this bacteria creates changes your human behavior as well as along vice versa too. And then the last thing's about the spaces itself. Yeah, the spaces. What kind of spaces become contamination? What kind of spaces? The tube wells itself, the storage tanks. Yeah. So and the implication for this at one level is just about the water contaminations. But I think at some level, this idea about gene transfer of higher horizontal, of non-linear gene transfer, I think is useful for thinking about social form too. It's useful for thinking about what I was talking about, infrastructure too. Infrastructure that doesn't just connect, but transforms fundamentally the very nature of being. It transforms in its own temporality. It transforms, it connects things without it being same. Yeah. So this problem of somebody and everybody, you can at some level see that some bacteria get impacted more, but at a larger level, within a time frame, everybody gets impacted. So you get to think about the differentiation while thinking about the connectedness of beings as well. Yeah. So it in some ways helps us keep the kind of the class differentiations, the gender differentiations, while also appreciating what some of the multi-species ethnography, or even this UN stuff of us being one being. So you can think about how we are biologically all connected, yet these differentiations are more important. And you know, maybe the open, you know, I can leave this with the Q&A. I'm interested in thinking about what does that mean for solution. The bio told me that I'm interested more in thinking about what can one do about it, and what can one do about knowing this kind of information. Does this lead to changing how we think about intervention, how we think about politics around this issue? I think there's some issues that I want to, you know, it'd be great to hear other people's also talk about. All right, thank you so much.